In the vast burning deserts of North Africa, where the war between Britain and the Axis powers became a contest of mobility, firepower and nerve, a new kind of fighting vehicle appeared on the battlefield. It was not a tank, though it mounted a tank's gun. It was not a scout car, though it moved with a scout car's speed and agility. It was something entirely new in the British arsenal, a heavy armoured car that defied conventional military wisdom and created its own doctrine through the courage and ingenuity of the men who took it into battle. It weighed over 12 tons, it mounted a weapon capable of destroying enemy armour at combat ranges, and it moved across desert and European terrain with a speed and confidence that belied its considerable size. It was the AEC Armoured Car, and this is the story of how an unconventional weapon built by a bus manufacturer changed the way the British Army thought about wheeled fighting vehicles, and how its crews used cunning, speed, and devastating firepower to take on some of the most powerful tanks the Axis could field. To understand why the AEC Armoured Car was so revolutionary, it is necessary to understand the role that armoured cars had traditionally played in military thinking. Since the First World War, armoured cars had occupied a specific and carefully defined position in the military hierarchy. They were reconnaissance vehicles, the eyes and ears of an army, tasked with gathering information about enemy positions and movements, rather than engaging in direct combat. Their virtues were speed and stealth. Their philosophy was elegantly simple: see without being seen, report without being reported, and above all, avoid a fight. The cardinal rule of armoured car doctrine was that engagement with the enemy, particularly enemy armour, represented failure. If an armoured car found itself in a firefight, its commander had made a mistake. The correct response to encountering enemy forces was withdrawal, the transmission of intelligence, and the preservation of the vehicle for further reconnaissance. This doctrine produced armoured cars of a particular character. They were light, fast, and lightly armed. The weapons they carried were intended to suppress infantry and provide covering fire during withdrawal, not to engage enemy armour. The armour they wore was proof against small arms and shell splinters, but offered no protection against anti-tank weapons or tank guns. The crews who operated them were trained to use terrain, speed, and darkness to avoid contact rather than seek it. British armoured cars of the early war period, vehicles like the Humber and the Daimler, were fine examples of this philosophy. Elegant, capable machines that fulfilled their reconnaissance role admirably, while scrupulously avoiding the kind of heavy combat for which they were not designed. But the realities of the Desert War in North Africa were challenging this doctrine in ways that conventional military thinking had not anticipated. The vast open spaces of the Western Desert created operational conditions unlike anything previously encountered by mechanized forces. Supply lines stretched for hundreds of miles across featureless terrain. Flanking maneuvers on a continental scale were possible in ways that European terrain would never allow. Small, fast forces could penetrate deep behind enemy lines, striking at logistics and communications far from the main battle. In this environment, the traditional distinction between reconnaissance and combat vehicles was becoming increasingly blurred. Armoured cars operating deep in the desert might encounter enemy positions without infantry or tank support anywhere nearby. The choice was simple: fight with what you had or abandon the mission. It was in this context that British officers began questioning whether the traditional light armoured car was adequate for desert warfare. The most radical voices argued that what was needed was not an armoured car that avoided battle, but one that could fight and win, a vehicle that combined the mobility of a wheeled vehicle with firepower approaching that of a tank. This was heresy to traditional cavalry thinking, but the Desert War was producing its own unconventional thinkers. Among them was a group of officers who had observed that armoured cars, if properly armed and armoured, could perform roles well beyond reconnaissance. They could hold ground, screen retreats, conduct aggressive raids, and most controversially, engage enemy armour under the right tactical conditions. The origins of the AEC Armoured Car lie not in a formal military requirement, but in a private initiative that was almost unique in British wartime weapons development. The Associated Equipment Company, known universally as AEC, was one of Britain's most important vehicle manufacturers. The company built buses and trucks for the London Passenger Transport Board and for commercial operators around the world. Their vehicles were famous for reliability, mechanical robustness, and engineering quality. AEC had already converted much of its production to military use, building military trucks and other vehicles for the war effort. But it was the company's director of engineering, Charles Cleaver, who decided on his own initiative to design and build a prototype heavy armoured car using AEC components. This was an extraordinary act of private initiative in a wartime economy where production was tightly controlled and innovation was supposed to flow through official channels. Cleaver recognized that the military's official armoured car programs were producing vehicles designed around the old reconnaissance doctrine, vehicles that were too lightly armed and armoured for the kind of aggressive warfare the desert was demanding. He used AEC's truck components as a foundation, including the heavy-duty chassis, engine and drivetrain from AEC's Matador artillery tractor, and designed around them a fighting vehicle that was fundamentally different in concept from anything in the British arsenal. The prototype was built in secret, essentially on a private bet that the military would want what he was creating once they saw it. The vehicle that emerged from AEC's workshops was immediately striking. It was big, considerably larger than any British armoured car then in service. It sat high on its four-wheel drive chassis, with an angular hull of welded armour plate that was dramatically thicker than its contemporaries. But the most startling feature was the turret, borrowed directly from the Valentine infantry tank, mounting a 2-pounder anti-tank gun of exactly the kind fitted to British tanks of the period. Here was an armoured car carrying genuine anti-tank armament, a vehicle that could theoretically engage enemy tanks on something approaching equal terms. The prototype was presented to the War Office in 1941, and the reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. The Army ordered the vehicle into production without delay. The production AEC Armoured Car, which entered service as the AEC Mark I in 1942, retained the essential character of Cleaver's prototype while incorporating refinements based on military requirements. The vehicle was powered by AEC's 6-cylinder diesel engine, developing 158 horsepower, giving it a top road speed of approximately 37 miles per hour and reasonable cross-country performance for a vehicle of its size and weight. The four-wheel drive system gave good traction in soft going, though the vehicle's considerable weight of 12 tons could cause difficulties in deep sand and mud. The crew consisted of 3 men, a commander, a gunner, and a driver, a smaller crew than most tanks of equivalent firepower. It was in this context that British officers began questioning whether the traditional light armoured car was adequate for desert warfare. The most radical voices argued that what was needed was not an armoured car that avoided battle, but one that could fight and win, a vehicle that combined the mobility of a wheeled vehicle with firepower approaching that of a tank. This was heresy to traditional cavalry thinking, but the Desert War was producing its own unconventional thinkers. Among them was a group of officers who had observed that armoured cars, if properly armed and armoured, could perform roles well beyond reconnaissance. They could hold ground, screen retreats, conduct aggressive raids, and most controversially, engage enemy armour under the right tactical conditions. The origins of the AEC Armoured Car lie not in a formal military requirement, but in a private initiative that was almost unique in British wartime weapons development. The Associated Equipment Company, known universally as AEC, was one of Britain's most important vehicle manufacturers. The company built buses and trucks for the London Passenger Transport Board and for commercial operators around the world. Their vehicles were famous for reliability, mechanical robustness, and engineering quality. AEC had already converted much of its production to military use, building military trucks and other vehicles for the war effort. But it was the company's director of engineering, Charles Cleaver, who decided on his own initiative to design and build a prototype heavy armoured car using AEC components. This was an extraordinary act of private initiative in a wartime economy where production was tightly controlled and innovation was supposed to flow through official channels. Cleaver recognized that the military's official armoured car programs were producing vehicles designed around the old reconnaissance doctrine, vehicles that were too lightly armed and armoured for the kind of aggressive warfare the desert was demanding. He used AEC's truck components as a foundation, including the heavy-duty chassis, engine and drivetrain from AEC's Matador artillery tractor, and designed around them a fighting vehicle that was fundamentally different in concept from anything in the British arsenal. The prototype was built in secret, essentially on a private bet that the military would want what he was creating once they saw it. The vehicle that emerged from AEC's workshops was immediately striking. It was big, considerably larger than any British armoured car then in service. It sat high on its four-wheel drive chassis, with an angular hull of welded armour plate that was dramatically thicker than its contemporaries. But the most startling feature was the turret, borrowed directly from the Valentine infantry tank, mounting a 2-pounder anti-tank gun of exactly the kind fitted to British tanks of the period. Here was an armoured car carrying genuine anti-tank armament, a vehicle that could theoretically engage enemy tanks on something approaching equal terms. The prototype was presented to the War Office in 1941, and the reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. The Army ordered the vehicle into production without delay. The production AEC Armoured Car, which entered service as the AEC Mark I in 1942, retained the essential character of Cleaver's prototype while incorporating refinements based on military requirements. The vehicle was powered by AEC's 6-cylinder diesel engine, developing 158 horsepower, giving it a top road speed of approximately 37 miles per hour and reasonable cross-country performance for a vehicle of its size and weight. The four-wheel drive system gave good traction in soft going, though the vehicle's considerable weight of 12 tons could cause difficulties in deep sand and mud. The crew consisted of 3 men, a commander, a gunner, and a driver, a smaller crew than most tanks of equivalent firepower. The armour protection was genuinely impressive by armoured car standards. The hull front was protected by 57mm of armour plate, thicker than the frontal protection of many contemporary British tanks. The sides and rear were thinner but still substantially heavier than other armoured cars. This protection was not invulnerable. German anti-tank weapons could penetrate it at combat ranges, but it was a dramatic improvement over the light armoured cars it served alongside. Crews who had previously operated vehicles that could be penetrated by heavy machine gun fire found the AEC's armour psychologically reassuring, though they quickly learned that reassurance and actual protection were not always the same thing. The 2-pounder gun of the Mark I was already becoming obsolescent by the time the AEC entered service, but it was followed rapidly by the Mark II, which mounted the far more capable 6-pounder anti-tank gun in a new and larger turret. The 6-pounder was a serious anti-tank weapon, capable of penetrating the armour of most German tanks at combat ranges. A Mark II AEC Armoured Car mounting a 6-pounder was more heavily armed than many of the tanks it might encounter in the Western Desert. The final production version, the Mark III, went further still, mounting a Ordnance QF 75mm gun, effectively the same weapon fitted to the later Cromwell tank, giving the AEC Armoured Car firepower equal to the main battle tanks of 1943 and 44. This progression from 2-pounder to 75mm represented a dramatic escalation in the ambitions of wheeled armoured vehicle design. Operating an AEC armoured car required a different mindset from anything the British Army had previously asked of armoured car crews. The vehicle's firepower and protection invited aggressive tactics that would have been suicidal in a Humber or Daimler, but the AEC was still not a tank. Its wheeled configuration, while providing superior road speed and mechanical reliability, meant it was more vulnerable to mine damage, more constrained in cross-country movement, and less protected overall than tracked armour of equivalent weight. The crews who mastered the AEC were those who understood precisely what its capabilities and limitations were, who could identify the tactical situations where its firepower and speed gave it decisive advantages, and who knew when discretion remained the better part of valour. The tactical doctrine that emerged around the AEC was shaped by the experiences of the first units to receive the vehicles in North Africa in 1942. These were primarily units of the Household Cavalry and other cavalry regiments that had converted to armoured cars, men who brought with them a cavalry tradition of boldness and aggression, but were adapting it to the realities of mechanised warfare. They quickly discovered that the AEC's firepower, combined with its speed and the psychological shock of a wheeled vehicle mounting tank armament, could be used to devastating effect in specific tactical situations. The vehicle was most effective not in the kind of straight-up armour versus armour engagement that tanks conducted, but in the swift, aggressive tactics of the ambush, selecting a position, striking hard and fast, and withdrawing before the enemy could respond effectively. The ambush was the AEC's signature tactic, and it was executed with increasing sophistication as crews accumulated experience. A section of AEC armoured cars, typically operating in pairs or small groups, would identify a likely enemy route of advance using their speed and the classic armoured car skill of long-range observation. They would select an ambush position that gave clear fields of fire while allowing multiple withdrawal routes, a wadi, a ridgeline, an area of broken terrain that would confuse enemy attempts at pursuit. When enemy vehicles, whether supply columns, troop carriers, or even tanks entered the killing zone, the AEC crews would open fire with everything they had, relying on their heavy armament to inflict maximum damage in minimum time. Then, before the enemy could organise an effective response, the AECs would use their superior road speed to disengage, disappearing into the desert before counterfire could be brought to bear. This tactic required precise judgment and iron nerve. The AEC crews had to position themselves close enough to their targets to ensure effective hits with their relatively short-range weapons, but not so close that they could not disengage quickly if things went wrong. They had to read the terrain instinctively, knowing which routes would allow rapid withdrawal and which would trap them in killing grounds. They had to make rapid decisions about when to press an attack and when to break off, balancing the opportunity for maximum damage against the risk of destruction. And they had to do all of this while managing a complex fighting vehicle in the heat and dust of the desert, under fire from an enemy who quickly learned to recognize and prioritize the distinctive shape of the AEC as a significant threat. The North African campaign provided the AEC with its proving ground, and the vehicle emerged from that campaign with a formidable reputation. At battles like El Alamein and during the subsequent pursuit of Rommel's Afrika Korps across Libya and Tunisia, AEC armoured cars operated alongside tank units and infantry formations, fulfilling roles that range from conventional reconnaissance to aggressive tank hunting. There are documented engagements where AEC crews engaged German armour, including Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, using the 6-pounder and later the 75mm gun to destroy vehicles that would have been completely impervious to earlier British armoured cars. These engagements were not without cost. AECs were lost to German anti-tank guns, mines, and tank fire. But the vehicle demonstrated that a wheeled armoured car could carry tank armament effectively, and that crews willing to use aggressive mobile tactics could take on armour that outweighed them considerably. One particularly dramatic incident from the North African campaign illustrates both the capabilities and the dangers of AEC operations. A section of AEC Mark IIs, mounting 6-pounder guns, encountered a column of German vehicles including several tanks moving through a desert defile. The AEC commander, recognizing the opportunity, positioned his vehicles on high ground overlooking the defile and opened fire before the Germans realized they were under attack. The first shots destroyed the lead vehicle and blocked the defile, trapping the following vehicles in a killing zone. In the brief firefight that followed, the AECs destroyed several vehicles before German return fire began finding the range. The commander ordered withdrawal, and the AECs used their superior speed to disengage before German tanks could maneuver to cut off their escape. 2 German tanks were confirmed destroyed, several other vehicles were damaged, and the AEC section escaped with damage to 1 vehicle but no crew casualties. It was a textbook demonstration of how the AEC was meant to be used. The crews who operated AECs developed a particular relationship with their vehicles that combined respect and affection with realistic assessment of its limitations. Veterans recalled that the AEC felt genuinely solid and capable in a way that lighter armoured cars did not, that the weight and thickness of its armour gave an impression, if not always the reality, of meaningful protection. The diesel engine was appreciated for its reliability and fuel economy, important qualities in the desert where logistics were always precarious. The fighting compartment was cramped by the standards of a tank, but relatively spacious for an armoured car, allowing the crew of 3 to work effectively during combat. The gun controls were adequate, the vision from the commander's position was good, and the vehicle's handling, while demanding given its size and weight, was manageable for trained drivers. But the AEC's limitations were equally well understood by its crews. The vehicle was heavy for an armoured car, and this weight told against it in soft sand and muddy terrain. In the desert, a bogged-down AEC was a dead AEC, visible to the enemy and unable to use its most important defensive asset, its speed. The wheeled configuration, while mechanically more reliable than tracks and faster on roads, meant that mines were a constant threat. A single mine could blow a wheel off an AEC and leave it immobilized and vulnerable, a fate dreaded by crews who knew that a stationary vehicle in the desert was a death trap. The vehicle's height, necessary to provide the internal volume needed for its fighting compartment, made it easier to spot and harder to conceal than lower-profile vehicles. When the focus of the war shifted from North Africa to Europe, following the Allied invasions of Sicily in 1943 and Normandy in 1944, the AEC Armoured Car faced very different operational conditions. The close bocage country of Normandy, with its thick hedgerows and narrow lanes, was as different from the open desert as could be imagined. The AEC's desert advantages of long-range observation and high-speed withdrawal were far less applicable when visibility was measured in yards rather than miles, and where lanes could become killing grounds in seconds. The vehicle had to adapt to a new environment, operating differently, but still proving its worth to crews who had learned its capabilities thoroughly. In the European theatre, AECs were employed extensively in a screening role, protecting the flanks of advancing infantry and armoured formations from enemy counterattacks. Their combination of speed and firepower made them effective at rapidly reinforcing threatened sectors, moving quickly along roads to plug gaps before enemy forces could exploit them. They were also used in the exploitation phase following armoured breakthroughs, pushing rapidly forward to seize bridges, towns and crossroads before German forces could organise defences. In this role, their road speed was particularly valuable. An AEC could cover ground faster than any tank, arriving at key objectives before the enemy expected it. The liberation of France and the Low Countries provided numerous opportunities for AEC crews to demonstrate the vehicle's capabilities in a very different kind of warfare. There are accounts of AECs entering towns ahead of the main Allied advance, engaging German rearguards with their heavy armament, and creating the impression of a far larger attacking force than was actually present. The psychological effect of a vehicle mounting tank armament and moving with armoured car speed was often significant. German rearguard forces, uncertain of what they were facing, sometimes withdrew when they might have held against a more cautious approach. The AEC's combination of firepower and mobility could create tactical dilemmas for defenders that neither a conventional tank nor a conventional armoured car could generate. The campaign through the Netherlands and into Germany in the final months of the war saw AECs operating in conditions of increasing complexity. Town fighting, river crossings, and the defence of road junctions all featured in their operational history. By this stage of the war, the crews who had survived the North African and Italian campaigns had accumulated enormous experience and developed tactical intuitions that made them highly effective in virtually any environment. They knew exactly what their vehicles could and could not do, and they operated accordingly, with the cool professionalism of men who had been thoroughly tested and had not been found wanting. The AEC Armoured Car also served with distinction in theatres beyond North Africa and Northwest Europe. It was used by Polish armoured car units serving with the British Army, who operated it with particular effectiveness during the Italian campaign. The Poles, fighting with a bitter determination born of their country's occupation and suffering, adapted quickly to the AEC's characteristics and used it aggressively in the difficult terrain of the Italian peninsula. The mountains, valleys, and rivers of Italy presented yet another set of tactical challenges, and the AEC's crews learned to exploit the terrain differently again, using river lines and mountain passes to channel enemy movement into ambush positions. The South African Army also received AEC armoured cars and used them in the Italian campaign, where they operated alongside British and other Commonwealth units. South African crews brought their own tactical traditions and experiences to the vehicle, further enriching the doctrine that had developed around the AEC. The vehicle's cross-theatre service, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Italy to the plains of northwest Europe, demonstrated its fundamental versatility and the soundness of its basic design. No single terrain type had revealed any fatal weakness, and in each environment the vehicle had proven capable of making a genuine contribution. The total production of AEC armoured cars across all marques was approximately 630 vehicles, a small number compared to the thousands of lighter armoured cars produced during the war. This relatively modest production reflected both the vehicle's late start and its position as a specialist heavy type rather than a general-purpose reconnaissance vehicle. The numbers were sufficient to equip the units that needed them and to demonstrate the concept convincingly, but not large enough to make the AEC a common sight throughout the army. Those units that did receive the AEC generally operated it for extended periods, accumulating the deep familiarity with the vehicle's characteristics that made them particularly effective. The legacy of the AEC armoured car extends beyond its direct military contribution to a broader conceptual legacy about what armoured cars could be and do. Before the AEC, British armoured car doctrine was essentially conservative and defensive in its ambitions. The AEC challenged this doctrine directly and convincingly, demonstrating that a wheeled vehicle could carry tank armament effectively, that armoured car crews could fight as well as scout, and that the traditional distinction between reconnaissance vehicles and fighting vehicles was more a matter of design philosophy than inherent limitation. The vehicle proved that if you gave armoured car crews genuinely capable weapons and adequate protection, they would find ways to use them to deadly effect. This legacy influenced post-war armoured car design in significant ways. The vehicles that succeeded the wartime armoured cars in British service were heavier, better armed, and more capable than their predecessors, reflecting the lessons learned from vehicles like the AEC. The Saladin armoured car, which entered service in the 1950s, mounted a 76mm gun in a genuine turret, a direct descendant of the philosophy that Charles Cleaver had embodied in his private initiative at AEC's factory. Later designs, including the wheeled tank destroyers that many armies adopted during the Cold War, represent further developments of the same fundamental idea, that a wheeled vehicle can carry significant firepower if designed around that requirement from the beginning. The men who crewed the AEC armoured cars left behind a legacy of tactical innovation and professional excellence that is remembered with pride by the regiments that operated the vehicle. Veterans who spoke about their AEC experiences in the decades after the war consistently emphasized two qualities: their respect for the vehicle's genuine fighting capability and their understanding that surviving in it required using its strengths, speed, firepower, and tactical flexibility while never forgetting its limitations. The AEC was not a tank, and treating it like one was a recipe for disaster. But used as the unique hybrid weapon it actually was, it was something the enemy found deeply difficult to deal with. Today, surviving AEC armoured cars are extremely rare. The relatively small production numbers, combined with the attrition of combat and the disposal of wartime equipment, means that very few examples remain. Those that survive are preserved in museums and private collections, where they attract the attention of historians and enthusiasts who recognise them as representing an important and often overlooked contribution to British armoured fighting vehicle history. Standing beside an AEC in a museum, one is immediately struck by its size and solidity. It is genuinely large for an armoured car, genuinely substantial in its construction, and looking at the turret with its provision for a 75mm gun, it is genuinely formidable. The vehicle has a purposeful, aggressive quality that sets it apart from the lighter armoured cars of the same era. The AEC armoured car was, in many ways, a weapon ahead of its time. It challenged orthodoxy, defied conventional categories, and proved that military necessity combined with engineering capability could produce solutions that doctrine had not previously imagined. It took a private initiative by a civilian engineer, the enthusiasm of forward-thinking cavalry officers, and the courage and skill of the crews who operated it in combat to transform a radical concept into a battle-proven fighting vehicle. The story of the AEC is a story of British pragmatism and adaptability, of the willingness to set aside doctrine when doctrine proved inadequate, and to create something new when existing solutions were not sufficient. From the burning desert of Libya to the hedgerows of Normandy, from the mountains of Italy to the plains of Germany, the AEC armoured car served in some of the most demanding conditions of the Second World War. It was never the most numerous vehicle in British service, never the most celebrated, never the subject of the popular attention that attached to famous tanks and aircraft. But for the men who took it into battle, it was a weapon they trusted, respected, and used with a skill and courage that deserves far wider recognition. The wheeled tank killer from AEC's factory proved every claim its creators made for it, and in doing so, changed permanently the way military thinkers understood the possibilities of the armoured car.